Have you ever felt like you weren't alone, even when you knew you should be? Hospitals, with their labyrinthine hallways and echoing silence, are places where life begins and ends, but sometimes it doesn't completely leave. What if I told you that working a night shift in an old hospital is more terrifying than any horror movie you've ever seen? What if I told you I lived through it? I never believed in ghosts. I thought stories about haunted hospitals were just urban legends, tales nurses passed down to scare the rookies. But when I took a night shift position at an old hospital on the outskirts of town, my skepticism was tested. The building had been around for over a century, its walls steeped in the history of countless lives and deaths. What I experienced there still keeps me awake at night. These are the ghosts of the past I will never forget. When I started working at St. Mary's General, the first thing that struck me was how outdated the building felt. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows across the scuffed linoleum floors. The hallways stretched on forever, their walls painted in a dull, sickly green. Even in broad daylight, the place had an oppressive atmosphere, as though it carried the weight of every tragedy that had ever occurred there. By the time my first night shift rolled around, I had already heard the rumors. Nurses whispered about Room 24, a place where call bells rang despite being empty, and about the shadow man who wandered the fourth floor. I laughed it off, chalking it up to overactive imaginations. That first night I learned how wrong I was. The empty wing. The hospital had a closed wing on the third floor, an area that had been shut down decades ago due to funding cuts. The doors to the wing were supposed to be locked at all times, but every now and then we'd hear strange noises from that direction. Faint whispers, the sound of footsteps, and sometimes the distant clang of something metallic. Around 2 a.m. I was doing my rounds when I heard it, the faint sound of crying. It was coming from the direction of the closed wing. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the locked double doors and stopped, straining to hear. The crying continued, soft and pitiful, like a child lost and afraid. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. I leaned closer, peering through the small, grimy window in the door. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but for a moment I thought I saw something. A shadow moving in the darkness. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away. The next day, I told one of the senior nurses what had happened. She just shook her head. "Don't go near the third floor at night," she said. "You won't like what you find." Room 24. The second incident happened a few weeks later. I was assigned to the medical surgical unit where Room 24 was located. The room had a reputation. Patients often complained about feeling watched, and more than one had asked to be moved without explanation. That night, the room was unoccupied, but as I walked past it during my rounds, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out into the hallway. Frowning, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the TV was on, static hissing from the screen. I grabbed the remote and turned it off, then went to leave. That's when the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, like a cool breeze brushing against my skin, but within seconds, the room was freezing. My breath came out in white puffs as I stood there, frozen in fear. Then I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper. "Help me!" The remote fell from my hand as I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I bolted out of there and refused to enter Room 24 for the rest of the night. The fourth floor was the most unsettling part of the hospital. It housed the ICU and a few overflow rooms, but it was also where the infamous Shadow Man was said to roam. One night, I was sent to the fourth floor to assist with a patient transfer. The hallway was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the soft beeping of monitors. As I walked toward the nurse's station, I felt it. A heavy, suffocating presence that made my skin crawl. I turned my head and there he was. A tall, shadowy figure stood at the end of the hallway, his form indistinct but undeniably human. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there watching me. I blinked and he was gone. Shaken, I hurried to the nurse's station and told the others what I'd seen. They exchanged uneasy glances but didn't seem surprised. "He's been here for years," one of them said. "Some say he was a doctor who worked himself to death. Others think he's something older. Whatever he is, he's harmless as long as you don't acknowledge him." I didn't stick around to find out if they were right. My last night at St. Mary's was the most terrifying of all. It was a quiet shift, and I was doing my rounds when the power went out. The backup generators kicked in, but the flickering lights only made the shadows seem darker. As I walked past the third-floor stairwell, I heard it again, the crying. This time it was louder, more insistent. I should have ignored it, but something compelled me to investigate. I opened the stairwell door and froze. The crying was coming from above, echoing down the concrete steps. Slowly I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the landing, the crying stopped. I turned, and there she was, a little girl in a tattered hospital gown, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She looked up at me and smiled, her teeth impossibly sharp. Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out completely. In the darkness, I felt her cold breath on my neck. I don't remember running, but somehow I made it back to the nurses' station. I quit the next day and never looked back. Hospitals are places of healing, but they're also places where the boundary between life and death blurs. The stories I've shared are just a fraction of the horrors I experienced during my time at St. Mary's. If you ever find yourself working the night shift in an old hospital, remember this: the ghosts of the past are always watching, and some of them don't want to be forgotten.